There's a question I want you to sit with for just a moment before we get into today's topic. When you imagine your retirement, the full arc of it, not just the first few years, do you picture it as one long, steady chapter? A single, unbroken stretch of time that looks more or less the same from beginning to end? If you do, you're not alone. Most people think about retirement as a destination. You work toward it, you arrive, and then life simply continues at a gentler pace. But here's what the research, and honestly, the lived experience of millions of retirees, actually tells us. Retirement is not a flat road. It has distinct terrain. It rises and falls. It shifts beneath your feet in ways that are sometimes chosen and sometimes not. Today, I want to walk you through a framework that I think is one of the most practically useful ideas in all of retirement planning. It's called the 3 phases of retirement: the go-go years, the slow-go years, and the no-go years. This concept was originally developed by financial author Michael Stein in his book, The Prosperous Retirement. And it has since become a foundational lens through which thoughtful planners and educators approach the retirement conversation. What I want to do today isn't just define these 3 phases. I want to help you understand what they mean for your money, your priorities, your energy, and your sense of purpose. Because when you understand how retirement actually unfolds over time, you can plan for it in a way that is honest, strategic, and deeply fulfilling. Let's begin. The essential insight behind the 3-phase model is this: retirement is not static. The variables that define your daily life, your physical energy, your health, your financial resources, your family responsibilities, and your sense of what matters most all change over the decades you spend in retirement. And they don't change in a predictable, linear way. Think about that for a moment. If you retire at 60 and live to 90, you are talking about a 30-year span. That's as long as most people's entire careers. Would you expect your life at 35 to look exactly like your life at 60? Of course not. So why would we expect retirement to be any different? The 3-phase model acknowledges this reality with clarity and compassion. It says that most people move through 3 meaningfully distinct stages during their retirement years. Stages defined largely by what you're able to do, what you want to do, and what the circumstances of your life allow. Understanding these stages in advance isn't pessimistic, it's protective. It allows you to allocate your time, your energy, and especially your money in ways that match the reality of how life actually unfolds. There's also a financial architecture embedded in this framework that deserves careful attention. Each phase carries a different spending profile. Your retirement portfolio isn't just a number that slowly decreases over 30 years. It's a resource that needs to be deployed strategically across 3 very different chapters of your life. And that's a nuance that far too many retirement plans simply don't account for. Let's look at each phase in turn. The first phase is the one most of us dream about when we imagine retirement. These are the go-go years, a period defined by high energy, good health, relative freedom from constraint, and an almost intoxicating sense of possibility. For most people, the go-go years begin at retirement and extend, ideally, well into their late 60s or even early 70s. But the defining characteristic isn't really a number on a calendar. It's a feeling. It's the ability to say yes. Yes to travel. Yes to new experiences. Yes to the hobbies you never had time for during your working years. Yes to a life that finally belongs to you in a way it never quite did before. This is also the phase where your financial picture is typically at its most favorable. You're entering retirement with the largest portfolio you've ever had. For those with Social Security, pension income, or substantial savings, the math often works. And equally important, if you find that it doesn't quite work yet, you still have the capacity to supplement your income. A part-time role, a consulting arrangement, a passion project that generates revenue. These are all realistic options in the go-go years in a way they simply won't be later. Consider what this phase looks like in practice for different people, because it looks remarkably different depending on who you are. For some, the go-go years means finally crossing off the destinations on their travel list. A month in Italy, a road trip through the national parks, a river cruise in Europe. For others, it means returning to something that got crowded out by decades of work and responsibility. A musician who sets up a home studio, a gardener who finally has the land and the time to do it right. A grandparent who takes every opportunity to show up at their grandchildren's school plays and Saturday soccer games. For one retiree in Colorado, the go-go years meant buying the quality road bike he'd always wanted and spending 4 or 5 mornings a week out on mountain trails. It kept him healthy, gave him a community, and brought a joy to his daily life that he hadn't expected. For another woman I spoke with in North Carolina, it meant throwing herself into volunteer work, mentoring young women through a local nonprofit, serving on the board of a community organization she cared deeply about. For her, putting something back into the world she'd benefited from felt like the most meaningful use of her newfound freedom. The go-go years aren't just about leisure. They're about freedom. Freedom to direct your own time toward whatever holds the most meaning for you. But here's the financial reality that comes with this phase, and it's one you need to plan for honestly. The go-go years are almost certainly going to be your most expensive years in retirement. Every enriching experience has a cost. Travel has a cost. Hobbies have a cost. Helping your adult children, whether that's supporting a home purchase, contributing to a grandchild's 529 college savings plan, or simply being there financially during a difficult stretch, all of that has a cost. Many retirees are surprised to discover that their spending in the first decade of retirement actually exceeds what they spent during their working years. This isn't a failure of planning, it's the natural result of a life that has been unshackled. But it does mean that your retirement budget needs to reflect this reality, and that you shouldn't design your financial plan around the assumption that your spending will be modest just because you're no longer commuting to an office. At some point, and there's no precise age or moment when this happens, the go-go years transition into what Michael Stein called the slow-go years. This is the second phase of retirement, and it's perhaps the most misunderstood. The slow-go years can arrive in one of two ways. Sometimes they're chosen. You've had a magnificent run of activity, travel, and experience, and you find yourself genuinely drawn toward a quieter, more grounded rhythm of life. The pace that once felt exhilarating starts to feel like enough, and a slower pace starts to feel like a gift. That's not resignation, that's maturity. That's knowing yourself. Other times, the slow-go years arrive uninvited. A health event, a physical limitation, a change in circumstances, something that narrows the range of what's comfortable or possible. This doesn't mean life becomes less meaningful. It means it becomes different. What typically changes in the slow-go years is the radius of your world. Travel doesn't disappear, but it often becomes more deliberate and closer to home. Instead of chasing every new destination, many people find themselves returning to the places they love most. The beach town where they've gone every summer for 20 years, the mountains where they feel most at peace, the family farm where the grandchildren know every path through the woods. There's a depth to this kind of connection that the constant pursuit of novelty can't replicate. Responsibilities also shift during the slow-go years in ways that are worth anticipating. Many retirees in this phase find themselves pulled toward their grandchildren in a way they hadn't fully expected. The gravitational pull of family becomes stronger, and in today's world, that often means becoming more genuinely present and involved, whether that means living closer to family, adjusting travel plans to accommodate school schedules, or stepping in to provide meaningful childcare support. These aren't burdens. For most people, they become among the most treasured aspects of this phase of life. There's also an important possibility worth naming here, one that the three-phase model sometimes obscures. The phases aren't necessarily a one-way door. Life has a way of cycling. You might move into a slow-go period because of a health challenge, recover, and find yourself with renewed energy for a new kind of adventure. You might slow down for several years while your grandchildren are young, then reemerge into something closer to the go-go spirit once they're older. The framework is descriptive, not deterministic. Your retirement is yours to shape. From a financial standpoint, the slow-go years typically bring some relief on the discretionary spending side. Fewer long-haul trips, less impulse spending on experiences. These tend to ease the draw on your portfolio. However, this phase often introduces a different category of expense: healthcare. Prescription costs, specialist visits, mobility aids, home modifications. These costs tend to emerge gradually and can be easy to underestimate if your planning only accounts for the spending patterns of your go-go years. A sound retirement plan will model for this shift explicitly, recognizing that the slow-go years aren't simply cheaper go-go years. They're a meaningfully different financial chapter with their own distinct profile. The third phase is the one we are least comfortable talking about, and perhaps for that reason, the one that tends to be the least adequately planned for. These are the no-go years. The no-go years are defined primarily by physical limitations that significantly constrain daily activity and mobility. For some people, this phase is brief, arriving late in life and lasting only a short time before death. For others, it can extend for many years, sometimes a decade or more, during which the world contracts significantly around them. I want to be clear about something before we go any further. The no-go years are not the end of a meaningful life. They are a different kind of life, one with its own gifts, its own rhythms, and its own forms of richness. This is the phase where what I'd call the dividend of memory becomes most precious. Every trip taken during the go-go years, every sunset watched from a porch in the mountains, every afternoon spent with a grandchild learning to ride a bike, those experiences don't disappear. They compound. They become the interior landscape you inhabit when the exterior world has grown smaller. People who built a rich life in their earlier retirement years consistently report that those memories serve as genuine sustenance in their later years. That is not a small thing. There's also something meaningful about the connections and communities that anchor the no-go years. The friendships built over decades, the neighbors who check in, the faith community that shows up with meals, the grandchildren who call on Sunday afternoons. The no-go years are in many ways a time of profound relationship, a deepening of bonds that a busier life sometimes didn't allow for. Now, let's address the financial reality of this phase, honestly, because it is where many retirement plans fall apart, not from poor investment returns or overspending in the early years, but from a failure to account for long-term care costs. Long-term care in the United States is staggeringly expensive. A private room in a nursing facility can easily exceed $100,000 a year. Assisted living communities commonly run $50,000 to $80,000 annually. In-home care, depending on the level of need, can accumulate at similar rates. And unlike a vacation or a new car, these are not discretionary expenses. They are costs you may have little control over for a duration you cannot predict. The mathematics here are sobering. A retiree requiring 5 years of nursing home care at today's rates could face costs approaching $500,000 or more. Medicare covers very little of this. Medicaid has asset and income requirements that make it inaccessible to most middle-class retirees until their savings are nearly depleted. Long-term care insurance is one tool, but it must be purchased while you're still healthy enough to qualify, and premiums have substantially risen in recent years. This is why your financial advisor, your estate attorney, and frankly you yourself need to have an honest conversation about long-term care planning well before you ever reach the no-go years. The time to make these decisions is not when you're in the middle of a crisis. It's now, while your options are still open. There's a concept in retirement finance that captures the spending arc of these three phases beautifully. It's sometimes called the retirement smile, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Here's what it describes. In the go-go years, spending is high, the curve is elevated. As you move through the slow-go years, spending typically decreases, the curve dips down. But then, as care needs emerge in the no-go years, spending can spike sharply upward again. When you graph it over time, the spending curve looks something like a smile. High on the left, low in the middle, rising again on the right. This shape has significant implications for how you structure your retirement income. A plan built around a flat, constant withdrawal rate doesn't reflect this reality. A more honest plan anticipates the elevated spending of the early years, plans for a more modest middle period, and then specifically reserves, through insurance, dedicated accounts, or other mechanisms, for the potential cost surge of late-life care. One of the most common fears I hear from people approaching retirement is this: what if I run out of money? And in truth, the retirement smile is where that fear is most likely to be realized. Not because someone spent too lavishly in their go-go years, but because the no-go years arrived with costs that the plan simply wasn't built to handle. Understanding this architecture doesn't create more fear, it creates better planning. It transforms a vague anxiety into a specific, solvable design problem. There's another misconception worth addressing here. Some people approach the no-go years with the assumption that because they won't be traveling or spending on experiences, their financial needs will be minimal. This thinking can be dangerously comforting. The absence of discretionary spending does not mean the absence of major expenses. It means the nature of the expenses has shifted, from the joyful and chosen to the necessary and often unpredictable. So, what do you actually do with all of this? The first step is to give yourself permission to spend meaningfully in your go-go years. This is something that runs counter to the instincts of many careful savers, people who spent decades deferring gratification in service of a future that has now arrived. There's a well-documented phenomenon among retirees. The people who die with the most money are often the ones who spent their final years regretting the experiences they denied themselves. This is not the goal. If you've done the planning work and the numbers support it, the go-go years are the time to live fully and intentionally. Books like Bill Perkins' Die with Zero make this case compellingly, not as a license for recklessness, but as a reminder that money unspent in a life that could have been richer is, in a real sense, wasted. The second step is to build explicit flexibility into your retirement plan. The go-go, slow-go, and no-go model is a framework, not a rigid schedule. Your life may not move neatly through these phases in order. You may cycle back. You may have a health challenge that temporarily shifts you into slow-go territory, then recover and reclaim some of the energy and freedom of earlier years. A good retirement plan and a good advisor will help you build in the flexibility to adapt as your actual life unfolds, not just the version of it you imagined at age 58. The third step, and I cannot emphasize this strongly enough, is to address long-term care planning proactively. This means having an honest conversation with your spouse or partner about the scenarios you might face. It means investigating long-term care insurance options while you still qualify. It means discussing with your estate planning attorney how your assets would be managed in a scenario where one or both of you requires extended care. It means taking seriously the possibility that your no-go years may be longer and more expensive than you hope, and building a plan that can absorb that reality without devastating your family. Finally, reflect honestly on what each phase means to you, specifically, not what it means for the average retiree, but for you. What does your go-go version of freedom look like? Is it travel or community involvement or creative work or grandchildren or something entirely? What would a fulfilling slow-go life look like when the time comes? These aren't abstract questions. They're the architecture of a retirement worth living. Retirement, when you understand it clearly, is one of the most complex and extraordinary chapters a human life can hold. It's not a single destination. It's a landscape, varied, sometimes demanding, often beautiful, that changes as you move through it. The go-go years are a gift. They're a window of energy, freedom, and possibility that most of us spend our entire working lives working toward. Don't let that window close without walking through it fully. The slow-go years are not a diminishment, they're a deepening, a shift toward the things and the people that have always mattered most, experienced with a clarity that only time can produce. And the no-go years, for all the practical challenges they carry, offer something that a rushed life rarely allows: the chance to be still, to receive love, to let the wealth of a life fully lived settle around you like light through a window. Michael Stein gave us a useful map. The terrain itself belongs to you. I'd like to leave you with one question to carry into your week. Don't answer it quickly. Let it sit with you. Which phase do you believe you're in right now, and what is the one thing you most want to protect, pursue, or prepare for in this chapter of your life? If you have thoughts on that, or if you've already navigated these phases and have wisdom to share, I'd genuinely love to read your perspective in the comments below. The conversation that happens in this community is one of the most valuable things we have here, and your experience matters to others who are watching and wondering what their path might look like. Thank you, as always, for spending this time with me. Until next time, take good care of yourself and of the people you love.